And we look at like the difference in the cost effectiveness. And it appears that psychotherapy is, for the recipient, somewhere around 12 times more cost effective.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Joel McGuire, research analyst at the Happier Lives Institute. The Happier Lives Institute studies how we measure well-being and how to improve people's well-being globally. Today, we discuss their major study on the surprising solutions to improving well-being most effectively. So thank you again so much for taking the time to talk about this area today. It's something that's really personally important to me, and I'm very happy that we can share it with a wider audience. But before we get started with all the technical details, I'd love to just hear, a bit about yourself and the Happier Lives Institute.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I am Joel McGuire. I'm a researcher at the Happier Lives Institute. A bit about myself is, in terms of education, I come from an economics background. I did my undergrad and graduate in economics, and then I started working for the Happier Lives Institute pretty soon after that. A bit about the Happier Lives Institute is we're a think tank with the goal of trying to maximize global happiness. And this project is naturally incredibly, idealistic and ambitious. But right now it has two parts. One is trying to find the best measure of well-being that exists and kind of like push forward on actually, measuring well-being and measuring happiness. I think that's the first step. We need to know, what it is that we're measuring and how to do it before we can, make any sort of decisions. And then the second part is, we just go and see like what the priorities are using this measure of well-being and see how that changes from how other people, have like done this project of trying to figure out our priorities for doing good, either in policy or philanthropy.
Sounds good. So it sounds like the Happier Lives Institute is focused on getting the right tools needed to be able to tell, hey, are we actually making people happier if we did, X, Y, Z? And then after you have the right tools, then figure out, okay, so what are the things X, Y, Z that we need to do?
That's a good summary.
Sounds good. So let's just dive right into it then. When it comes to doing good, most people are not thinking, what is the different degrees of good? How do we measure good? So if you could actually, give that nuanced breakdown of the different ways that we measure good, how is that currently done?
Yeah, so this is a big question, a huge question, in fact. And I'll preface it by saying that, my training is in social science. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher. And so the first thing is that there's a lot of different conceptions of what is ultimately good. And this is just a huge question of value and moral value in philosophy. But, like common sense, leads to a lot of, intuitions about what is good. A lot of people think truth is ultimately good. Knowledge, complexity, these things may be ultimately good in some way. But I think something that most people can kind of like robustly agree is a good thing is how well people's lives go for them. And this is typically what we refer to when we refer to well-being. And I'm just going to substitute, this question of good for like this question of well-being, because I don't think there's like too many people out there trying to rigorously, like maximize the amount of beauty in the world. But the question that we're concerned with, I think, is mostly how do we measure like well-being? And, starting with the most common way that's used by, governments and academics, and is still like really strong in economics, is just using income and consumption. The logic is mostly just like, okay, well, it's like when you're richer, you'll be able to do the things you want to do. That's pretty common sense, intuitive. I mean, it's also a common concern that's like, with just looking at income changes, we could be missing out on a lot of things like environmental services. They don't show up in any, sort of like income accounting. And also, like a lot of bads don't show up in income either. And so it's just like income can't capture a lot of, like what we, think probably matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. You might not be wealthier, but maybe you are less sick. That's, a big thing in terms of health. That's not captured by your income. Are there any measures of well-being about that?
So some development aid organizations measure people's health and use this as a proxy for well-being. And this is commonly done using DALYs, or disability adjusted life years. So disability adjusted life years are the years of life lost plus the years of life lived with disability. And this is derived from asking people how much health is lost in a particular disease state. And this is specifically compared to, say, a year of healthy life. So if we're looking at blindness, for instance, what we'll come up with is some comparison commonly made by the public between a year of healthy life and a year of blindness. And what is, compared to being completely healthy, the badness of having this particular state?
So that does make sense that we're looking at health in, the number of years people gain and also how good those years are given, whichever health conditions they have. Are there any drawbacks to this kind of approach?
So like, well, I would say like these are an improvement over just like looking naively only at income. They still have like these limitations of, okay, well, I can be less healthy, but I can still, I can still be happy. Yeah, it's like, okay, well, like people when they get older, they actually seem to be happier than when they're in middle age, and well, their quality of life has obviously gotten like much worse. So like what's going on there? Is this a point where we trust kind of like the health literature and just see like, okay, old people's lives are just getting like worse and worse and worse, and just like, well, that sucks. Or we're like, oh, there's actually like this interesting, maybe somewhat counterintuitive thing that happens. No, it's like, you get old, maybe you're a grandparent, and you like maybe learn to relax and enjoy life a little bit more. And like the way, these are constructed is you ask like a bunch of people in the general public, be like, okay, well, so, if you were blind, how much time would you basically sacrifice to not be blind? And they just kind of like, well, then like do that exercise of reflecting, and to avoid a year of blindness, like I would, give up a month. It's just like from these kind of like public judgments and like leaps of imagination, this is actually how we kind of like score the badness of many of these conditions. And all of them are constructed in this way, but this is certainly the most common way. And an obvious concern is like, well, how do you know like how bad it is? I mean, shouldn't we just like be asking like the blind people how their lives are going, and then like try and, maybe back out from there? So they rely on people's judgments about how bad a certain condition is.
Thank you for that overview. So it sounds like there are these two fundamentally different ways of measuring well-being. One all about the dollars and financial well-being, and the other about the health. Is there another, third option that maybe encompasses both of these?
So to round out kind of these ways of like trying to measure good, and where like the Happier Lives Institute comes in, is what happens if we take seriously how people like self-report that their lives go. Like, for example, if I was like, like, how happy are you on a scale of 0 to 10, just like in general, with your life. So if we take this as like seriously, informative about kind of like your internal states and about how you kind of like evaluate your life, then how does that change how we, measure doing good? And I think, the thing about these self-reports of like happiness or life satisfaction is that they seem to have very strong face validity. It's just like, why don't you just try and like ask about the thing you care about? It's like, why are you like measuring income or like health? It's like, okay, if you care about like well-being and like well-being is like probably like something related to how people are like feeling inside of their brains, then why don't we just ask them, like how they're doing? Now the key question here is like do people's like self-reports of, like their well-being, are they actually like accurate and reliable in a way in which we can trust them? And that is, a big question, like still open to a lot of debate. And I think that's where like a lot of like some of the most interesting and important like research is being done.
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview of how all of these different ways of measuring well-being work. Now, we've been focusing a little bit on the theoretical side so far, but why don't we talk a little bit about the applications too? So these different ways of measuring how much good something can do, well, that might be very useful for a charity, deciding how do we spend all of these millions of dollars? Who do we help? Could you talk about some of the current standards that charities use to make these decisions?
Yeah. So, first I'd like to preface like it's still like not an incredibly common thing in like the world of charity to basically have advisors actively, like making like judgments about like what would be like the best thing to do. What's still, like much more common is like something like Charity Navigator, where it's just like all these things could actually do a bunch of different good. We'll leave like the decision about like what is good and bad like up to you, like the person actually doing the donations, and we'll like provide some additional information that could like potentially act as like a tiebreaker between, like two random charities you select. And so there, I would like to point out there's just like very few people trying to actually like advise philanthropists in terms of like doing good. Be like, okay, you want to do good. How do you get like the most of that? How do you do that like way better than you would probably do it before? But the biggest one of this is GiveWell. They move like hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And their goal is to aim them to the charities that do the most good while, having an impact that is basically like well evidenced. And so they have like a certain kind of like certainty and confidence in their impact, which is different from the mandate of just trying to do as much good as possible, which in some cases, like necessarily departs from having evidence. So GiveWell, when they're trying to figure out how to do the most good, what they typically look at is they look at, income changes, and they also look at years of life extended. And these two, naturally incompatible units, they then kind of like collect, like everyone on the team. And so they ask everyone, okay, how would you convert between these things? So how would you convert between doubling consumption for, a household in Kenya versus like saving the life of like a 2-year-old in, let's say, also Kenya? And then something they've done, more recently is they've also just like tried to ask for the preferences of the people they're actually trying to benefit. They think that, we have a lot of evidence on, income, and we can measure that. And it seems to be like we can reliably measure income. For example, with cash transfers, they can just see how much it increases, their income and how long that lasts through, say, investments, purchases of durable goods, whether it, frees up someone to seek and find, better employment. And then, surprisingly, that's also how they, capture the benefit of, say, like deworming. They mostly, like base benefit just on how it seems like deworming, like over quite a long time span, increases like people's income.
Would you quickly define cash transfers and deworming?
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course. So cash transfers are, pretty straightforward. Cash transfer charities focus on just directly sending like money to people in generally extreme poverty. And deworming is just giving people, typically like children, courses of anti-parasitic pills. So, commonly like people will be walking around barefoot, and there will be like parasitic worms in the soil, and they'll be able to like basically, just infect people. I mean, like one, they're just like painful. They cause like suffering directly. But then also, it's like when you're a kid and you have like parasitic worms, it makes it a whole lot harder to like hang on to the little bits of like nutrition that you can find when you're in extreme poverty. And kind of an interesting point on deworming is most of the time, since deworming is so incredibly cheap, where it's like cents for a pill, that most kind of like organizations that do deworming don't actually try to do any monitoring of who actually does or doesn't have parasitic worms. They just give it to like everyone in an area because that's actually cheaper than, doing any sort of, like monitoring and like verification and testing.
This is very interesting. So they consider these income and health metrics, and those are the kinds of investments they're decided that make a lot of sense. Now you changed that initial assumption. You thought, well, what if we measured subjective well-being, just asking people what would make you happier? And your research showed a different conclusion. I'd love to talk about that.
That's a good question. So a bit of kind of like the backstory here is like, why do we exist if GiveWell is kind of like already doing a very similar thing to what we would like to do? And the motivation, behind this is like, it's like, well, is there something that, we're missing when we only look at like health and, income? And one of the things that, comes out of the subjective well-being literature is just like how bad like mental disorders are for like people's happiness. I mean, you can almost take it as like synonymous. Many people do that. Depression is just like the opposite of like happiness. Part of what led to the creation of HLI was this case of, okay, so like mental health disorders seem to have a really high like impact on subjective well-being, like how well they report their lives are going, but it doesn't appear like that they actually have like that large of an impact, when we measure them in terms of like DALYs. So it's like, okay, well, one possible explanation for that is that people are just like really bad at like simulating how bad depression is because it's not observable. But, it turns out that I think that's like one of the worst states that someone could be in. And so like one of the first questions we wanted to ask is like, are we missing something? And because it seems like depression is really bad and no one's really looked at any sort of treatments for depression, particularly like deployed in like low and middle income settings. And so it felt like a natural question for us at the time to be like, well, like how good is just like trying to treat people with psychotherapy to like treat their depression? Like, are we missing something?
Exactly what is psychotherapy?
That's a hard definition to pin down. But I would say like psychotherapy is trying to solve like someone's state of like psychological distress by like a discussion format where you just like talk, and then there's like many different strategies of kind of like conversation used across all the different types of psychotherapy, such as like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalytic, where they'll like ask you about your dreams, or, like interpersonal therapy where they focus on, your relationships as like a source of distress. Like psychotherapy is a big wide world. And so, starting almost like 2 years ago, we kind of like embarked on just this research project where we wanted to basically redo what GiveWell's done, but except in terms of subjective well-being. And the first big, piece of research to come out of that is this like meta-analytic cost effectiveness comparison between cash transfers and psychotherapy, where we look at the effect of cash transfers. Like we just gather all of the best available, like evidence, which turned out to be like 45 studies on cash transfers. And then, we look at about like 40 studies from like psychotherapy, and these are all in like low and middle income settings. So similar to the settings we would actually expect these charities to deploy to. And we look at like the difference in the cost effectiveness. And it appears that psychotherapy is, for the recipient, somewhere around 12 times more cost effective, but like within a range of 4 times to 30 times. So like we have like some amount of uncertainty here.
So we think about all of these interactions with therapists that we are funding, and you found that you said 4 to 30 times more cost effective than cash transfers. Is that like 1% happier per dollar? Is that the unit that we're measuring?
Oh yeah. So what we actually use is somewhat like technical, and this is standard deviation changes in people's subjective well-being scores or their affective mental health scores. And so subjective well-being is, again, how people report to generally single questions that ask about how they feel about their life in general, such as how happy are you with your life in general? How satisfied are you with your life, like nowadays? Whereas this other category that I mentioned of affective mental health is this name of convenience I use to refer to depression, anxiety, and psychological distress. And I take these as the kind of like mental health disorders and their corresponding measures that just track people's average levels of mood quite accurately. So like the questionnaires that capture people's affective mental health, such as like a depression questionnaire, they often ask about, how someone feels. Was your sleep restless? Were you happy? Did you enjoy life? Did you cry a lot? Did you feel sad? Did you feel like you were like good for nothing, like you'd been a failure? But they also include like other questions that don't seem to be about people's emotional states, but more about how they're coping with life and their behaviors. And so these are things like, I did not feel like I was eating. I felt like everything I did was an effort. I just want to give an overview of kind of like the two types of classes of questions that people are typically answering in these studies and where we actually get kind of these estimates of benefits from. And, then we have to do a bit of like technical wizardry to just try and get all of these outcomes onto like similar scales. Because, for example, if one scale is like 0 to 10 in terms of like the points you give someone to like choose from, and then another is like 0 to 100, that's basically what we do when I say standard deviation changes, is it's just a way of trying to get all of these changes in comparable units.
Okay. So now that we have these units defined and, some of the process behind the study, this is quite significant. We're saying that the best charities in the world, the ones that are most focused on doing well, they might be funding the wrong type of outcomes if we change the way that we're defining well-being. What are the next steps from this? What are the implications that you'd like to see from your research?
Yeah, so I think the first implication is just as you said, if we use like a different measure of well-being, we get different things that appear to be priorities. And so, the next thing is to see, really like how much this is the case. So like GiveWell, for instance, they think of deworming as the best available like life-improving charity intervention. And so one of our next projects is to just go through and look at deworming. How does deworming look in terms of subjective well-being or anti-malarial bed nets, but then also like going and looking at new things? Because what would be like really weird and surprising would be if like, we go out and like and just find new things, maybe like somewhat at random, and they just like seem like just as good as these things that, have been like unbeaten for like a decade, because like GiveWell's like recommendations just haven't changed very much. And then it's like, if you take, us seriously, it's like this wasn't too much the result of, like a really like thorough preliminary analysis, but it's also like the specific charity we looked at, Strong Minds. It just so happened to be the only mental health charity that shared its cost information with us. We didn't choose it because it seemed like it was the best. It was the one that gave us their data. I don't think the takeaway is that, like Strong Minds is like 12 times better than Give Directly. Like psychotherapy is great and we should just like fund psychotherapy. My takeaway is like much more like, this is like worth looking into. We were able to do this analysis and, we found something surprising. And so I think we should, potentially look for much more cost-effective ways to implement psychotherapy, such as like through like mental health apps. That's one thing I think is, potentially like really promising. But, ultimately, if we find that just like the priorities change by a huge amount, which it's still unclear really like how much kind of like our recommendations will differ from GiveWell, because we haven't done too much of like the reanalysis. I think this like will really like motivate us to like come around to what I think is the original fundamental question of what's the best measure of well-being. And I assume it won't be so much like, there's just like a clear winner, but it's like, okay, under these assumptions, but these are the assumptions you need to make. This is the measure that you'll use. But, at least for the next year, we just plan on doing a lot more of these analyses. Like, as I said, be looking into deworming mental health apps. We'll also be looking into things like cataract surgery. We'll be going back over and reanalyzing the traditional life-extending interventions, such as like antimalarial bed nets. We have some weirder, more out there things that we would like to consider, such as like concrete flooring, which like a preliminary analysis like made concrete flooring look like really good. And then it's funny just because it sounds so boring. Also consider things just like air purifiers. Another thing that like we like to look at, within the year, who knows if we'll get to it, is looking at like more policy level interventions and like trying to, ask these broader questions like, okay, if we legalized, psychedelics in some form, what would be the impact, of that in terms of subjective well-being? When we're kind of like thinking about these like policy level questions, it becomes like much more, like speculative and much more uncertain. But ultimately, like these policy level questions seem to be really the ones of like the most importance. And so, what I think HLI would really like to eventually move to is, it really seems like a proof of concept to like look at these charities. And of course, like moving money from like less effective charities to more effective charities seems to be something of, importance. But, ultimately, if we're trying to like maximize like global happiness, it seems like sooner or later, we're going to have to get to the people with the real money and power and, see if we can say anything helpful about, what are, like more effective policies and less effective policies.
No, it'll be exciting to see which new results come out of this new way of looking at the world. I'll say it's almost like, for so long we had a red lens and we were looking through that lens and things appeared red. But now we're like, okay, what if we change it to a blue lens? What happens? So I guess it'll be cool one day. We have all these different lenses. Which one do we choose to look through? If anyone is curious to, see which picture you're developing, where can they keep updated with your progress looking at these different interventions and policies?
I think the first and most obvious place is our website, the Happier Lives Institute, and sign up for our newsletter. I think like every quarter. And if you have like interest that's more than that, then reach out, ask us questions about, whatever you find on our website. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk.
No, that sounds good. I'll be sure to link your website in the description as well as the paper in question. I really appreciate you walking us through the basics and definitions of what's currently going on. We look at our assumptions and then moving to what that future world could be like if we decided, hey, there's an alternative way of looking at things. So this has been a really insightful discussion. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been fun.